Welcome to the second week of harvest here at Hendry. Please drop a note in the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from. I see Jim. Jim, we just saw you on Sunday. You maybe win the award for traveling the least distance here. And we're glad you're joining us virtually as well. Hello, hello. All right. Well, welcome. We'll do some brief introductions here while we give people a chance to tune in. I'm Megan Carter with the Hendry Winery, here with, of course, the one and only Mike Hendry. We have set this up as a webinar today, and many of you I know have done these with us a number of times now over the last few years. So you're probably quite familiar with it, but we'll give you a little rundown of the technology or as a little reminder. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a number of tools. Tonight we'll be using the chat and the Q&A. So if you open up the chat, you'll just want to make sure that your blue button is set to everyone, so you can chat with everybody rather than just the hosts and panelists. And then over in the Q&A button, if you open that up, you can submit your questions, which is what we hope that people will be doing tonight. So please use that. Let's see, anything else we need to make sure you know? The one and only Angela Douglas is, of course, with us tonight. Oh, hi, Chuck and Lizzie. Welcome, welcome. Angela's on the chat, so be sure to tell her hello. Let us know where you're tuning in from and what you're drinking. Mike and I will tell you what we've got in our glasses here in a moment. And I think we should get going, shall we?
Sure.
Talk a little bit about, we thought we would, before opening it up for questions, just give you a little overview on what the vintage has been like so far. As I mentioned earlier, we are now in our second week of harvest, so we can talk a little bit about that, and then we'll open it up for your questions. So, Mike, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, harvest has been really good so far and easy. It feels really easy after what we went through last year, but we started picking Chardonnay on September 11th, which was our third latest harvest in the last 25 years. And we have been picking steadily ever since. And it's been, the weather has been relatively cool. Our highs lately have been in the 70s. We've been in the low 80s a couple of times. And in that kind of situation, the fruits ripening very slowly and evenly, and it's easy to kind of go pick it when we want to.
Awesome. And so you said this is our third latest harvest, meaning the latest that we've started picking. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
And what was unique about last year? What sort of sets this apart so far?
I don't know if unique is the right word. There's certainly, even though I said this is our third latest, we've started a few days earlier several times. It has been a very cool summer, and we had plenty of rain last winter, but the timing of the rain was really good. So we had a lot of rain and had the soils really saturated, which is what we want when the vines started to grow. And then it just never really got hot. I think we hit 95 degrees a couple of times for a day, and then went back to highs in the 80s. And it's just been a very steady growing season. Vine growth, I mean, what really changes the year and vine vigor is late rain. So rain in May and even into June can really sort of change vine growth and vine vigor, but we didn't get any of that. So it's been pretty ideal, I think.
Well, good. All right. And so some people, I think a lot about the summer weather and always ask us, as we're heading into harvest, well, what was the summer like? And think that that's, really what has prompted a lot of our decision making when it comes to harvest. But in actuality, you can, with a degree of certainty, kind of predict in late spring when we're going to start picking. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
And once we see bloom, we really know within a few days when we're going to pick. So I went back and looked today before we did this we picked around 15 blocks yet. And I think that the furthest off the picking time that we've been for those 15 is 5 days from the date I predicted in May. Most of them are 1 or 2 or right on. So it turns out that in the spring, when you first get bud break, if the temperature's below a certain level, then it does really delay vine growth and maturity. But once you pass a certain temperature level, the time between bloom and harvest is very predictable. Now, summer weather can really change the characteristics of the fruit and the flavors. There are things like heat waves like we had last year, or rainstorms that can kind of make you pick a little earlier than you might want to otherwise. But even in that case, often it'll shift it 4 or 5 days earlier. It's not, it's not a massive change.
Yeah. So, and to back up maybe a little bit, if it's helpful, these vines kind of have this annual life cycle, right? You talked about bud break, which for us typically happens, March or so. And then 6 or so weeks after that, we get bloom, which is when the vines get pollinated. And that's when we start this clock, so to speak, right? I mean, I remember one, instructor telling me that this button gets flipped and all of these vines are kind of on a steady march, and there's not a whole lot you can do at that point to disrupt them. So it is different, of course, for every single variety, which is, one benefit of having all the varieties that we do here is that some ripen more quickly than others. So we can kind of space out our picking. But once you see bloom, and once you call bloom in a particular vineyard block, you're able to count out, what is it for Pinot Noir?
About 108 days.
And say, we're going to pick on this day.
So for something like Cabernet, I'm just looking at
all of our data here.
Spreadsheet, but for Cabernet, it's about 130 days from bloom to harvest. And for things like Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, it's more like 108 to 110. And Chardonnay and Pinot bloom before the Cabernet does. So that's why harvest for us with the different ripening times and the different bloom times is typically spread out over 6 weeks.
Do we think it'll be 6 weeks this year?
I don't know. If just looking at the bloom dates, so what was pretty late starting was the Chardonnay, as I already mentioned, but the other varieties weren't that far behind the Chardonnay at bloom. So just on the surface, it looks like harvest will be a little compressed. But if the weather stays cool like this, then it can, it certainly makes it easy to stretch out the picking times without any real consequence,
any downside.
But for now, we're sort of, according to average bloom to harvest, we're going to be picking through mid-October. And the latest we've ever really picked here is October 21st or 22nd. So it'll be late again. But I think now, given what we have to pick, we'll be picking, 4 acres a day or so for the next 4 weeks, and that'll be it.
All right. Well, so that was Peter, I see your question. We'll get to that in a minute about night picks. So just to summarize, to date, we have picked our Chardonnay, our Albarino. All of the Pinot Noir.
Yes, we finished Pinot today. Well, we have one Albarino block to finish tomorrow, 27.
So that is what Mike and we are curious what you're cheersing with. We're cheersing with Albarino and Pinot Noir to celebrate today. So cheers. So Peter, you asked a great question, which is that some wineries harvest white grapes at night. Do you ever do that? And do you think it makes a difference in Napa? And I know.
So this is my thoughts are not. You'll hear a different take on this from different people, but what's quite important is the temperature of the fruit, and you don't want to bring warm fruit into the winery. It can be very difficult to sort of control the fermentation early on. It can affect your ability to remove juice if you want to without extracting phenolics. But with the idea in mind that it's important to have your fruit cool, the coolest part of the day, the coolest time of the day is just before sunrise. So if having the fruit cool is a priority, you want to be spanning your picking around sunrise. And what I see people do with night picks often is start at 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, when it's certainly, especially in warmer weather, it's still warm at 7 or 8 in the evening. So
they've had 12 hours of sunlight.
Yes.
That they've been baking in, right?
So what I sort of cynically say sometimes is that these night picks are often designed to make it easy for the people at the winery to show up at 8 a.m. and have the fruit already be there. It sort of pushes the late nights onto the vineyard crew, and not the winery people. So, having said that, I do think there are times when it's very important to try to do your picking around the coolest time that you can. But right now, with highs in the 70s, there's really no problem picking into the early afternoon. So yeah, and I've done both. I mean, I've done the night picks, I've done the every version of this, but it's really only important, in my opinion, when it's really hot. And right now, it's the consequences of picking later in the day are not serious at all.
Not enough, yeah. And Peter, you asked in your question, you made the point about Napa specifically, and that could be different, right? In other areas, if you're picking fruit in the Central Valley or something where it's significantly warmer, maybe you would make that decision. But
what we do when I get up what we're doing now is starting picking at 6 a.m. when it's plenty dark. Sunrise now is about 7. And on most of these days, we're picking starting at 6 and picking till 11 or noon kind of thing. Which is that's a decent day of picking, but it's really interesting to get up, when it's pitch black out here and you look across the valley and you can see these patches of light all over from the night picks going on. It's kind of fun.
Yeah. I mean, I remember in, I think 2017, when we had that some pretty hot weather in September.
Horribly hot.
I remember an early-ish start, around 4 o'clock in the morning one time. But it was not that the fruit needed to be picked then. It was that you were trying to get in a lot of picking before it got too hot later in the day. So that's
we were trying to. It started, and this happened last year too. I mean, I remember one day when we, by 4 a.m, it's cooled down a bunch, but on one of the days last year it was 97 degrees at 10 a.m. So there wasn't much you could do in those cases.
Yeah, pretty brutal. So yeah, thankfully it looks like so far, knock on wood.
Really this has been really easy. And another important thing about this harvest is that we have more fruit than we've had for a long time. You have to go back to 2012 and 2014 to have the sort of crop levels that we're seeing this year. And crop level, it's an important topic. I mean, a lot of fruit for us means something like 3 tons per acre, which in most cases, on average, about 3 tons per acre. And California averages 6 or 7 tons per acre for its vineyards for the most part. So 3 tons per acre for us is a lot. And it's, it's nice to see. Yeah. The vines have really kind of bounced back very nicely from the years of drought that we had recently.
And you attribute that really to the amount of rain we had this winter?
Yeah, partly. So there are several variables that go into what crop level is. And obviously, how many clusters you have, how many grapes are in each cluster, and how big the grapes are the things. And by tweaking those 30% either way, you can wind up with huge swings in crop level. So you need weather at set that's good.
At fruit set.
Right. Fruit set at bloom. Yeah. Right. And the other thing now, I mean, I have a bunch of clusters on the table here. This is a large Zinfandel cluster, but and you can see within it, you already have some grapes that are starting to dehydrate a little, but you don't have the same sort of whole cluster collapse that you see when it's really hot. So overall, the grapes are bigger this year, which is a big part of the crop level difference. And also when the vines are very water stressed early on and at bloom, the clusters tend to shatter more. So you get less grapes, you get less grapes, and then ultimately smaller grapes.
Shatter meaning you would like look at a cluster and there'd be like large pockets of things that didn't develop.
Just
Very
missing grapes.
yeah,
So this, for
grapes.
example, is a Cabernet cluster, and you can see, I mean, although it's loose, I mean, it's the grapes aren't tightly packed. It's you know, you can't really see through it. And if you get what we call a lot of shatter early on, you'll be able to, you know, see through parts of this cluster. You know, for example, this is again a very sort of tight. I searched around for a Chardonnay cluster that people missed, but you can see it's a relatively tight bunch of grapes.
Yeah.
And so in those other years, yeah, you've got smaller, looser clusters and smaller berries, and I mean, cluster number can also vary year to year, but it's probably the less, and cluster number for the most part is determined by the weather the previous year. So that's not an in-year variable.
Yeah. And I think that's actually that to me was one of the most interesting things that I ever learned, is that the weather in one year can impact the following year's crop.
Right.
You know, again, people are so focused on, you know, what was this June, July, summer, what was the summer like? And a lot of the important weather can happen in the spring or the winter or even the year before.
Yeah.
Which I think is really interesting.
And also the you know, the way the vines grow and behave is also they store carbohydrates from the previous year that helps them with growth in the spring and the next year. So in years where you've had a lot of drought, or years where the vines have had a lot of fruit on them, if this is one of the consequences of really overcropping vineyards, is that they can have a very difficult time ripening fruit in the subsequent years.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I think the discussion about crop levels is interesting, because I think one of the sort of ideas that a lot of people have is that, you know, crop level and quality have an inverse relationship, that they don't always go hand in hand. But as you said, it's so much more nuanced than that, right? Because it's about, you know, there are so many factors that go into determining crop levels that can impact the quality, but also, as you said, high yields for us is still, in the grand scheme of things, fairly low.
Quite low. Yeah. And this crop levels, it's an important topic, and everyone agrees that at some level, crop level becomes important. They argue over what those levels are, is the way it works. And, you know, for example, one of my favorite Cabernets, certainly my favorite in recent history, is the 2012 Cabernet. And it also corresponds with some of the higher crop levels we've had in Cabernet, which are, you know, 3.5 tons per acre, which, you know, when you're talking about high crop level in Cabernet, you're talking about 7 or 8 tons per acre. This is not, it's not a level where the vines have a hard time ripening it. There's an interesting book on this topic, that covers parts of this topic. It's called Terroir and Other Myths of Wine Growing, which is, the author is Matthews, I think his name is. He's a UC Davis professor. But and you know, to go back to that title, it's not to say that terroir is not important, right? We know it is, and we know it's an important part of wine and why we like it. But what the point, Todd Matthews is his name, the point he's trying to make in the book is that if you look at a bunch of the conventional wisdoms in winemaking and you try to correlate that with research that's been done, there's often poor agreement. And I remember in there, he looks at Napa and he says, well, if, you know, really low crop levels are important, certainly reviewers should consider the low crop level years in Napa some of the best vintages, and that it's certainly not the case, right? So and you know, there's a lot to unpack there, but you know, it's just an interesting point. And there is a level where vines can have a hard time, you know, getting even sufficient sugar in the grapes to ripen them. But also, and what I've seen in some of the extreme years of drought, where you have very small berries and very low yields, you don't get a very dense, concentrated kind of wine, especially if it's within multiple years of drought.
Yeah.
I think if you have sort of good vine vigor and growth in one year followed by a drought year, you're much more likely to get densely concentrated wines in that case. But if you're in the third year of drought and these vines have had a hard time
struggled
getting it done, then I think you might be surprised at how those yields and wines taste in those vintages.
And that dovetails really nicely with this next question, which was, we said that the grapes are bigger. What impact does that have on the flavor of the wine?
Yeah, so again, the simplest way to look at this and sort of the logical one is that if, we know that all the color and really the phenolics we're after are coming from the skins here and not the juice. So in theory, the smaller the berries, the greater the ratio between skin and juice, and the more concentrated wine. And that kind of holds. It holds pretty well, but what you don't see, like when you do have a lot of dehydration in grapes, you don't have really intense color. It doesn't work that way either. And in fact, the times at which people pick, often the phenolics and the color compounds tend to peak before the grapes start to dehydrate. So certainly the peak of phenolic concentration is often before people pick them. So there are factors that are working against each other in this, but and for example, there's so this is a Pinot Noir cluster, and the berry size isn't so different than the Cabernet cluster, but the concentration of the phenolic structure is very different. So obviously you have varietal components that weigh into this. So it's in truth, smaller berries is going to be, on average, it's going to give you more phenolic concentration, but there are many other factors that complicate that.
Yeah, which is, I think, you mentioned something here, all these sort of the phenolic ripeness, and all these flavors and everything that we're looking for don't necessarily dovetail with the rate at which sugars and acid levels are changing in the grapes, right?
Right.
So I think that's something when people talk about harvest, how do you know when you're going to go pick? How do you know when the fruit's ripe? People talk a lot about bricks. You hear that phrase thrown around a lot. You hear a lot about acids. You don't hear as much about sort of the phenolic ripeness. And
that's here's the way I think about this. You can think about fruit ripeness in several different ways, and sugar and acid are sort of the easiest to think about. The normal ripening process in fruit is that sugars increase and acids decline
in relationship to one another.
Right.
Yeah.
But sugar and acid may be the least important things in all this, and then I think you have flavors, which is a more vague term, but we all have a sense of, what fruit tastes like when it's underripe and when it's overripe. We got a green banana or a super ripe, squishy banana, right? Or cherries, or we all have a concept of underripe and overripe flavors, and maybe flavors that we like the most somewhere in between. And then there's this broad class of compounds called phenolics, which include the color compounds and the tannins, which are the things that, dry out your mouth when you drink a wine. And so one of the big topics when it comes to phenolic ripeness is seed ripeness. And I'm probably not going to get grape juice all over this table, but in a grape that's not ripe, if you peel it apart, you see these very bright green seeds, and there are these extremely bitter, unpleasant, like if you chew on them, you'll make a funny face and spit it out. But the problem with phenolic ripeness, to me, and people, they taste grapes and look at seeds and say, we want these milder, brown, crunchy, sort of nut-like seeds. And that's true, and it's important, but if you wait forever, you have very nice mild seeds and a whole bunch of raisins. Right. So, really what you want is all of these factors to reach the point that you want them to reach at the same time. But in reality, and there are other practical factors, right? It's, let's say I'll go back to last year again, right? If you're having highs in the, 110 degrees for 4 days in a row, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you want to pick, you just can't pick it fast enough. So you've also got the practical constraints of how fast you can bring it in. And so you may find yourself, let's say, we want to bring in all the Zinfandel next week. That might mean we need to start picking some of it a little before we want and some of it a little after. And that's why in a year like this year, it's so nice to have, warm but steady temperatures where the fruit doesn't change quickly, and you do have time to go get it right around when you want it.
Yeah. Logistics there.
Just Mark A. Matthews. There we go. I see that on the
Angela's that book. Mark A.
I said Todd. Mark, right? That's
All right. Let's see. We'll check. Please do send in other questions. I have plenty of questions to keep Mike busy, but if you have others, this is all about. You've asked some great questions so far, and neither of those were questions that we had anticipated. So please keep the good questions coming. But in the meantime, I'll throw a couple of others out at you. So we've now picked everything, either the whites. We have one more block of Albarino, as you said. If someone were to come and walk through the vineyard in those blocks that have been picked, they might see little clusters of fruit left out there, right? So what's that, and why don't we pick it?
Second crop is what that is, or what we call it. And so when we prune these vines, that there are a number of different ways to prune, but we leave what we call a spur that typically has 2 buds, and that each bud produces a shoot. Sometimes it produces 2, and we come back and remove one. But at each point along that shoot where you get a leaf and a bud at the base of that leaf, a couple of buds actually, we call that a node. And on the opposite side from the leaf is usually a tendril. So what a flower is in a grapevine is a sort of a tendril that turns into a flower. And when this main shoot grows, we usually have the clusters, let's say on the second or third and fourth nodes. They're typically 2, sometimes you get 3, sometimes you get 1, but basically they're on down at the base of the cane on the first few nodes. So another one of the things where the leaf attaches, there's what's called a lateral bud. And if that lateral shoot grows off of the main shoot, then the pattern repeats itself. So on the first, third, or fourth node along the lateral shoot, you'll get another flower and another little cluster. So in general, a lot of second crop is a sign of a vineyard that's more vigorous than you want it to be. So if you have a lot of laterals and a lot of second crop, what it means is your vines aren't pruned properly, or you've got them in a site where you can't control vine vigor. And extra clusters and at a higher level, that starts to sort of deplete vine resources and affect the first crop, but also, it's, people do pick it and make wine from it. A lot of home winemakers, there are vines that have second crop on them that people are more or less welcome to have. But because these lateral shoots appear at different levels, so instead of all these main shoots starting to grow up more or less the same time, you have a lateral shoot that came out here, and then 2 weeks later, a lateral shoot that came out there. So you have a much greater variation in ripeness. And also a lot of the ripening has to happen at a time when the vines are starting to lose their leaves. So, second crop, if you're picky about how you do it, you can make some nice wines from it, but it's much harder to do.
Yeah. And there's not, again, it has a lot to do with how you've managed the vine. So it's not something we necessarily really have a lot of, and it's not ever worth it really for us to go back and we do anything with it.
Yeah. We have more second crop this year than we've had for a while, because really we have twice the vine growth this year than we did 2 years ago. Literally, if you were to prune the vines and weigh what you prune, you'd have twice as much this year as 2021. And still, like, I don't view this year, if we'd had more rain in May and June, that would have been even more severe. But this, in terms of vine growth and when the vines stopped growing, we're about where we wanted to be.
That's good. So looking ahead to next week, what else do we still have to pick?
So we'll move into next week. we'll finish the Albarino tomorrow. We may pick the Merlot on Saturday. And then I think we'll move into Malbec and the Primitivo right after that.
Okay.
And maybe some Zinfandel toward the end of the week.
And so then typically after that, we go into the Zinfandels, and then we sort of finish up with Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot.
Right.
Am I missing anything there?
No.
So that's typically our sort of how our harvest unfolds.
Yeah.
Okay.
And some of the Zinfandel and Cab will start to overlap, and there are a few things that overlap, but generally we start in Chardonnay, and then Chardonnay and Pinot overlap a little bit, and Albarino's in there somewhere, and then we move into the Zins.
And how, you talked a little bit about, what we have left to pick. How much fruit do we typically pick in a day?
Well,
there are a couple ways, I guess, to answer that.
Yeah, right? It depends a lot on what you're picking. So if you're talking about tons and you're picking
that versus
Zinfandel vines that have 12 of those, versus an Albarino vine that has 25 of these that are up in the canopy and hard to find. So, a crew of 12 could fairly quickly pick 16 tons of Zinfandel in 4 or 5 hours, but it could take all day to pick 10 tons of Pinot. So today we picked around 4 acres, I think. And that's sort of a typical day. We could, in Zinfandel, we could pick faster. But 3 to 6 acres might be the range.
And to some extent, there's a degree of restraint on the back end, on the receiving end, right? Because we're bringing all this fruit into the winery. So the idea is, the vineyard crew they start bringing all the fruit into the winery. We've got our cellar team set up here. And depending on what they're doing that day, if it's, white wine grapes, they're throwing them in the press. If it's red wine grapes, they're crushing them. And so bins start to sort of stack up. But there's a processing speed too, which has to be accounted for, right? And we don't want to pick a ton of stuff and just have it sitting around the winery for 2 days while they catch it.
Right? No. So, and we never do that. It doesn't, we don't, sometimes we'll carry a bin over from one night to the next morning, but, sort of the biggest bottleneck probably is the press. And right now, if we pick 10 tons of Chardonnay in a day, that means 3 press loads, and 3 press loads is a long day at the winery.
Yeah. How long does a press?
Well, by the time you load it, run the cycle, clean it up, get everything in and out. You're 3 hours or 2.5 or 3 hours in each.
And I know that, going back to the question about the implication of, the higher crop levels and the size varies and everything like that. When we first started, a couple days in, Jeff Miller, who many of you know, our general manager here, was talking about tank space. There is an idea, and there's a lot that you do to try and estimate crop levels, and that gives us right before we start picking. But some years and sometimes we spend a lot of effort estimating crop. I mean, this year I didn't spend a ton of time on that, but it does help with the planning and tank space and all of that. And sometimes you nail it, and sometimes you're off a little bit, and you're left kind of trying to figure all that out. So it can vary, but I always think it's important to note that we have here at Hendry a full-time. Our vineyard crew, they are Hendry employees. They are full-time staff. They are here year round. And many of them are incredibly long tenured. They know this vineyard incredibly well, and they're incredibly knowledgeable. And I feel like a lot of what I've learned about the vineyard is from them. So they do incredible work, and I think it's definitely worth shouting that out.
So it is, right. And I'm, some of the same guys that I was picking grapes with here when I was 17 or still, what that was a while ago, or still here picking. Believe it or not, we have one guy who's 84 out there picking. And I'm also excited to say that we have a couple of guys that are 18 now. So
new additions.
So one of our other guys, his sons showed up to pick, and it's nice to have some younger legs and backs out there.
But if any of you are on Instagram, and we're also, if you're not on Instagram, if that's not your thing, we are running a harvest journal on our website too, where we're carrying over some of those pictures. And Tamara Landry has shared some really fabulous photos of some of our crew members, and has noted how long some of them have been with us. So we definitely owe a lot to them this time of year. So
yeah. And it's sort of the time of year you spend all year, working on these vines and this fruit. And this is sort of the moment of that. This is what we've been, that this is what it's all about. It's fun to see those bins full of the grapes that you've been working on since March,
Yeah. All right. So so we have a question about the fires, which I think is a really big topic. There's also a question from Drew Hendry. This could be, I think you could probably address this quickly, which is how Drew would like to know how the crusher works.
Oh, so Drew, you know how the crusher works. So we have what it does first is separate the grapes from the stems. So the grapes we pick the grapes and dump them into a hopper, which slowly carries them along a sorting line.
Like this.
Yeah. And you have a chance to look for something that's overripe or underripe, or, maybe something with botrytis in it. And when they travel off the end of the sorting line, they fall into another smaller hopper on the crusher. And that draws them into a cylinder that has a helix inside. And that helix has a bunch of rubber feet that tumble the clusters and knock the grapes off the stems. And then it augers the stems out one side. The grapes fall through holes in that cylinder that's spinning. They get pushed back along the bottom with the blade, and then they fall into a crusher that has some interlocking teeth that you can adjust the spacing on.
Right.
So you can crush the fruit more or less
intensely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I also saw a question about fires.
Yeah. So during the fires of 2020, a lot of wineries didn't pick the fruit because of smoke and ash. Are there any reasons that vintners would not pick a fruit? Other reasons why they would not pick fruit other than smoke?
Yeah, I mean it's if it's all raisins, maybe you don't want to pick it, and that happens, or it's badly sun damaged. So if you have, I remember years where people were sort of feeling like things were never going to ripen, and then they went and removed a bunch of leaves, and then we got a bunch of hot weather, and so sun damage can, and then you can have to go back and sort through it and remove some of that stuff. And in some cases, it's bad enough that you're not going to pick it. Botrytis, bunch rot is a big one. And the only year that we see botrytis here and there, and can avoid some of those clusters that have it. So, and there are people who deliberately make wines with botrytis. When we get botrytis, usually it comes along with a lot of really nasty, smelly rot within a cluster. And we pick around it. In some years, where there's a lot of fruit on the vine and you get a big rainstorm, and that's only happened one year that I can think of, which was 2011. It can really make there were a bunch of people that wanted to leave the fruit out a lot longer, and a lot of the ones that tried wound up with such a botrytis problem that they couldn't really pick it. And other people worrying about the botrytis picked it earlier than they wanted to. So those were your choices in 2011.
Yeah.
So those are three things. And through the year, there are a lot of little things that lead to fruit that we remove. We remove clusters from very short shoots. We remove clusters that are clumped together, which again can be a botrytis hazard. We remove clusters that are suffering from sort of the effects of a variety of fungal problems. There are reasons why we'll drop a cluster here and there, but in terms of losing a whole block or sort of a whole vintage, smoke can be one. A lot of rain leading to botrytis can be another one, and sun damage and heat damage can be a third.
Yeah. But, and some of that I would imagine could be, valley wide or something, but a lot of that would probably be a little more specific, whereas those fires, you saw big chunk, swaths of the area that were affected by the same issue, the smoke and the ash. Whereas, there are things you could do, as you said, throughout the year that might potentially lessen your risk of having a lot of botrytis bunches.
Yeah, but it's right. And so one of the things, for example, one of the things you can do if you're worried about botrytis is do a lot of leaf removal, which can lead to more sun exposure and sunlight. But then if 3 weeks later you get a blast of heat, then you are in trouble again. So it's hard to, it's hard to, you don't always, you make a call based on what you think, but it's hard to predict the weather more than about a week out.
Yes. And that's another, benefit of having, our own wonderful crew is, we can make sort of decisions at us, at the 11th hour, maybe a little more easily than we could otherwise.
Right. And a very important part of the way we pick, most of the fruit here is picked by people who are being paid by the ton. And they're in a big hurry and they're picking everything.
Not here at Hendry, but here in the valley,
right?
In Napa, in a lot of wine, many wine regions, right? Yeah. So not at Hendry, but elsewhere.
Right. So what we do, our guys are paid by the hour, and they, know that if it doesn't look good and it doesn't taste good, don't pick it. That there are people who, and places where second crop gets thrown in. Clusters with a lot of botrytis, they find their way to the bottom of a bin, and it's all stuff that gets weighed, and these guys get paid by the ton. So they have you don't necessarily blame them. They have a financial interest in making sure everything goes into the bin.
Well, they're also,
it's not,
the faster they can go, they can move on to the next job and get paid for that. And so it's also a matter of not being as discerning just because you're trying to go quickly too, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but yeah, I think the way we do it.
Yeah, no, it's most of the sorting, a lot of people here make a big show out of sorting on a sorting line, and we do that as well. But we like to say that the most important step in the sorting is what we do when we're picking.
Yeah.
And there are different versions of sorting that happen throughout the year. So things we remove that I already mentioned. Yeah.
I remember one year, as I said, most of what I've learned from the vineyard comes from Mike or our vineyard team. And, I was attempting to learn, and so was helping out with harvest, and was, they're fast. I gotta say, I was the weak link in that change. So I was given the job of standing on the back of the tractor and pulling out any bunches that had made their way in that were perhaps, bodra size. So there was one level of sorting right there.
Yeah.
That was, I was struggling to keep up.
Yeah, no, it's even if I say they're not going super fast, they're still,
it's impressive. Yes.
efficient and moving along. So.
Yeah. So Chuck and Lizzie, I think this is a great question. So knowing that we still have a lot to pick, what excites you about this year's harvest? What should we be looking forward to? I'm glad you guys are excited about everything, but anything in particular?
I'm not, I don't normally, I'm excited about a lot of it is what I want to say. The way and I don't normally talk like that, but the way the year has gone and the way the fruit is ripened. Yeah. I'm usually happy to talk about the things that I'm not happy with, but I like the way the fruits ripened this year, and the vineyard. I fly a drone around and take aerial photos, and just sort of the uniformity, and the sort of the look of the vineyard. Excuse me. I think we're on the right. We got the right level of water stress. The vines were able to produce enough growth to ripen the fruit well. We haven't had. I think sometimes when we get a lot of heat, especially early in the year, it can produce these sort of lean, hard, tannic styles of wine. And it's just been even and warm. And I think a lot of this stuff could be really good. And we've got 30% more of it than we normally do. So
we're glad you're excited too, because there will be a lot of wine available for you.
Yeah.
So please, we've got about 15 minutes left if you have other questions. One that I thought would be kind of fun, or one topic that we could address would be what happens after harvest. There's like all this buildup for this moment, but there's still, it's not that like we're going to be done come mid-October and everyone's like going to go home for a couple months. There's still quite a bit to do out there, right?
No, and that's, I mean, we have a full-time crew, right? So we need to keep everybody working. So a lot of the maintenance, working on drip systems, trellis systems, we make a point of going through the entire vineyard and identifying vines with diseases and problems that need to be pulled and removed. And then we take an inventory of what we need to order for replants next year, broken stakes, broken posts. The show goes on. And for me, so I spend a lot of time working with our vineyard crew. And as long as harvest is not a big panic, if we're not in a big rush to get things done, harvest is a relatively easy time from my perspective, because everybody's doing the same thing. They know what to do. And we kind of understand the time that it'll take. As soon as harvest is over, I wind up with 12 guys doing a number of small different jobs that all need tools and supplies and things more organized. So right. Yeah. But yeah, we keep going. And so a lot of I sort of think the time for maintenance is and pulling sick vines. It's important that we still have some leaves on them so we can diagnose things. Mm-hmm. The remainder of October, November, and into December, and then people generally take their vacations around Christmas and New Year's. And when they come back, most of what we're doing is pre-pruning and starting to prune. Yeah. So this is sort of the time for maintenance.
Yeah. And is there anything you need to do to prepare for winter weather here?
Yeah, there are some areas where we have to look at what the creek might do, mm-hmm. areas where we might have erosion issues.
Erosion control stuff.
Another big job that I forgot to mention was we have to go through and pick up all the rocks. So through the course of the year, the discs and the equipment turn up a lot of rocks that then become things you run over and hit with the mower the next year. So we have to go through the whole vineyard and pick up tons and tons and tons of rocks.
What do we do with all the rocks?
Put them in piles. We've got areas. We've got
check out our rock piles.
Yeah, we've got a lot of rock piles.
Yeah. So okay. So yeah, we do have some stuff, but in terms of weather that we have to do, but the vines are starting to go dormant, and we really then just start to look forward to next March.
Yeah. And for me, the busiest time of the year and when there's a lot of urgency is through, April, May, June, and into July, when there are so many things that need to be done. And it takes, with our crew, it takes a long time to get from one end of the vineyard to the other with suckering or leafing or one of those things. And when all the tractor work has to be done. And, a lot of the time you feel like these vines need attention every 2 weeks, but you can only get to them every month. So there's a lot of time pressure then, but once the vines go dormant and really, there are other things to do around the winery and winemaking, but you don't have the same time pressure that you do through the growing season and the harvest season.
Yeah. That to me was one of the most interesting things when, I started working here and sort of seeing how the year goes. Again, there's all this like anticipation. It's when the valley gets the most visitors, harvest. Everyone gets really excited about it, but maybe you're probably even busier in the spring, and that's arguably a more stressful time.
The busiest time of the year in the vineyard, for the most part, is the growing season and sort of bloom through veraison.
Yep.
But it is, there are also, in most harvests, I feel like there's often a period of a week or 3 or 5 days that are really long ones, but it's not a sustained thing. And this year so far, what could cause, there's some rain forecast early next week. I don't know if it's going to be much. I don't think the forecast is very clear yet, but the one thing that could really get us still is a pretty big rainstorm.
Yeah. So think, sprinkles, think fairly dry thoughts for us.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Right. I think we've got most of them. Feel free to throw one or two more in there. All right. So, and what are you going to do when harvest is over? What do you like to do, Mike?
Well, if I can, I'm going to go fishing for about a week, but
that seems like
I don't have a solid plan for that yet. I got to get to where I can see my way through to the end of picking. So
it's nice to have something to look forward to, though. So
yes.
All right. Well, unless there are any more, I think we can sign off. I will say that if you're interested, Mike and I did this. You may not be able to tell, but we did this quite regularly 3 years ago during the height of the pandemic. And we have a number of videos on our website, under the videos tab. And there's one that I actually did with Jan Miller, who does a lot of work with George around fermentations. Sort of this time of year as the fruit's coming in, getting crushed. She's working with him on that. So you can check out that if you want to know about sort of the next step of the process. We've got some fun videos we threw into an email that we sent you guys, but it's also on the videos page. A really lovely video Mike did a couple of years ago of sort of what a day or two looks like here on the Hendry Ranch in terms of harvest. So you can sort of see people, picking the fruit coming in and getting sorted and all of that. And there's just also some very cool imagery. So we encourage you guys to check that out. And lastly, we just want to say thank you. This was part of our Member Appreciation Month efforts. We're grateful for you guys every single month of the year, but harvest is the time where, you kind of get a little reflective, and we are very, very grateful for all the support that you give this, small family vineyard and winery and organization, and we really couldn't do it without you. So, we've got a number of opportunities. Hopefully check our calendar. We've got a couple more events this year. We would really love to see you out here, or just come for a tasting and get to taste all of what we've been up to. So
sounds great.
Thank you again, and cheers.
Thank you guys. Yeah. Cheers.
All right. Bye-bye.